Some secrets sounded too dark to be real, too disturbing, too dangerous. So they were dismissed, labeled as rumors, called conspiracy theories, until documents surfaced, until history answered back. For a long time, this idea sounded like nothing more than a conspiracy theory. A story difficult to believe. That after World War II, the United States secretly recruited former Nazi scientists. For many people, the concept felt impossible to accept. The war had just ended. The world had learned about concentration camps, about atrocities, about human experiments, about unimaginable destruction. The public narrative seemed clear. The guilty would be punished. The ideology would be condemned. History would close the chapter. But geopolitical reality rarely follows a purely moral script. While the world celebrated the end of the war, tensions between former allies were already beginning to rise. A new conflict was quietly taking shape. The Cold War. Fear once again became the driving force behind strategic decisions. This time the fear was not invasion, but technological superiority. Ballistic missiles, advanced aviation, weapons development, aerospace research. Nazi Germany, despite its crimes, had invested heavily in science and military engineering. The development of the V-2 rocket, for example, represented a major technological leap for its time. And this is where the story becomes deeply unsettling. Because instead of being viewed solely as enemies, some of these scientists became extraordinarily valuable. Operation Paperclip was a real United States program designed to bring hundreds of German scientists to America. Many had worked directly for the Nazi regime. Some had been involved in military research. Others had controversial pasts tied to the war. And this is precisely what made the subject so difficult to accept. Because the simplified version of history is comforting. Good versus evil. Victors versus defeated. Operation Paperclip introduced something far more complicated. Strategic compromise. The official justification was pragmatic and cold. If the United States did not recruit these scientists, the Soviet Union would. And in a world increasingly dominated by nuclear fear and ideological rivalry, technological advantage became a priority above almost everything else. One of the most famous examples is Wernher von Braun, a leading rocket engineer in Nazi Germany, later becoming a central figure in the American space program. His contributions were instrumental in the development of the Saturn V rocket, the very machine that would carry humans to the moon. The historical irony is difficult to ignore. Technology associated with human progress, born from a deeply militarized past. But Operation Paperclip is not just a story about rockets or space exploration. It is a story about uncomfortable moral questions. How far nations are willing to go in the name of national security. Where justice ends and strategic interest begins. What happens when ethical boundaries collide with geopolitical fear? For decades, ideas like this were often dismissed as exaggeration, rumor, or conspiracy. Because reality seemed too contradictory, too disturbing. Until declassified documents, historical investigations, and official acknowledgments confirmed the existence of the program. Operation Paperclip was not fiction. It was a real chapter of early Cold War history. And perhaps what makes it most unsettling is not simply that it happened, but what it reveals. That history is not always shaped by clear moral lines. Sometimes, it is shaped by fear, power, and decisions made in the shadows. While some operations were unfolding far from public view on an international scale, others were taking place within society itself. COINTELPRO. The name stands for Counterintelligence Program. At first glance it sounds technical, almost harmless. Just another bureaucratic label. But the reality behind it was far more unsettling. The program was launched by the FBI in the 1950s, officially designed to monitor and counter what were described as threats to national security. At least that was the justification. In practice, the targets were not limited to spies or extremist organizations. They included political activists, civil rights leaders, social movements, and anti-war groups. Individuals operating inside their own country. The methods went far beyond simple observation. Surveillance, infiltration, disinformation, psychological pressure. Campaigns aimed at discrediting and destabilizing organizations from within. The objective? To weaken, disrupt, and fracture movements considered politically dangerous. One of the most well-known examples involves the monitoring of leaders within the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. became one of the figures placed under intense scrutiny. Anonymous letters, psychological intimidation, attempts to damage his public image. For the general public, the idea that a federal agency could carry out such actions against its own citizens seemed almost impossible to accept. Sounded like a conspiracy theory. An exaggeration. Because institutions are typically associated with law enforcement, stability, and protection. COINTELPRO challenged that perception. For years, the program remained largely unknown to the public. Its existence only came to light in the 1970s, after activists broke into an FBI office and obtained documents revealing the scope of these operations. And this is where the narrative dramatically shifted. Because prior to that moment, suspicions about large-scale political surveillance were often dismissed as paranoia. After the documents surfaced, denial became far more difficult. It is important to understand. COINTELPRO was not merely about gathering intelligence. It involved active intervention, manipulation, strategies designed to create internal conflict, mistrust, and psychological destabilization. The implications are profound, because they raise a question that remains deeply relevant. When does surveillance become protection? And when does it become control? For many people, the existence of such a program once seemed unthinkable. Until history confirmed otherwise. COINTELPRO was not a theory. It was a documented reality, revealing how fragile the line between security and suppression can become. There are moments in history so shocking that, when first heard, they are almost instinctively rejected. Not because they lack strategic logic, but because their moral implications are deeply unsettling. Operation Northwoods is one of those cases. In the early 1960s, the world was gripped by the intense tension of the Cold War. This was not merely a military standoff. It was a conflict defined by fear, ideology, perception, and the constant shadow of nuclear catastrophe. Relations between the United States and Cuba had deteriorated rapidly following the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union. To American military leadership, Cuba was no longer just a neighboring island. It was perceived as a potential Soviet foothold dangerously close to U.S. territory. Within this climate of geopolitical anxiety, proposals emerged that today seem almost unbelievable. Operation Northwoods was a plan developed within the U.S. Department of Defense that suggested the orchestration of staged or fabricated incidents. The objective was to create a credible pretext for military intervention against Cuba. The scenarios discussed were deeply controversial. Simulated attacks on American targets. Manufactured acts of violence that could be blamed on Cuba. Events designed to manipulate public perception and generate support for military action. Some declassified documents referenced ideas such as the staging of aircraft hijackings, acts of sabotage, and other dramatic incidents intended to provoke shock and outrage. It is important to understand. This is not a modern internet rumor. The existence of the plan was later confirmed through declassified documents. And that is precisely what makes the subject so disturbing. Because the concept of a false flag, operation is often associated with speculative conspiracy theories. Yet Operation Northwoods demonstrates that such ideas were, at least at one point, formally proposed within official strategic discussions. The true shock does not come only from the content of the plan, but from the fact that these scenarios were seriously considered within institutional frameworks. For the general public, the notion that government structures could contemplate fabricating incidents to influence opinion seems unthinkable. Sounds absurd. Like fiction. Like conspiracy. But Cold War logic operated under a different reality. Fear dominated decision-making. Strategic advantage became an obsession. Public perception became a battlefield of its own. It is essential to clarify. Operation Northwoods was never implemented. The plan was not executed. But its existence alone fundamentally alters how such ideas are perceived. Because it shifts the question from, would anyone ever consider something like this? To, there were official proposals that did. And perhaps that is the most unsettling realization. Not that it happened, but that it was imagined, documented, and debated at the highest levels of power. Operation Northwoods remains one of those historical episodes that challenges the simplified narratives we often rely on. Because history is not always shaped by clear moral boundaries. Sometimes those boundaries are tested quietly in the shadows. Modern history is filled with events that, when first revealed, were met with disbelief. Not because they were impossible, but because they seemed too contradictory, too risky, too difficult to justify publicly. The Iran-Contra affair is one of those cases. During the 1980s, the geopolitical landscape was defined by Cold War tensions. Regional conflicts had become pieces in a much larger global struggle for influence. Within this climate, covert actions took place that would later erupt into a major political scandal. At the center of the Iran-Contra affair was a chain of secret operations. The sale of weapons to Iran. At a time when Iran was officially regarded as an adversary. The funds generated from these transactions were then redirected to support the Contra groups in Nicaragua, who were engaged in a violent conflict against the Sandinista government. The controversy was layered. First, the arms sales appeared to contradict the public stance of the United States. Second, the redirection of funds bypassed restrictions imposed by Congress. And this is where the situation becomes deeply unsettling. Because from the outside, the public narrative and the hidden reality seem to be in direct conflict. Policies declared openly. Actions conducted in secrecy. For many observers, the revelations sounded unbelievable. How could weapons be sold to an enemy? How could prohibited operations be funded? How could such a system function? Initial reactions included skepticism, denial, suspicion, because the story resembled the plot of a political thriller. Yet subsequent investigations, official hearings, and documentary evidence confirmed the existence of these operations. Iran-Contra was not speculation. It was a real scandal carrying serious political consequences. Its impact extended beyond institutions. It altered public perception, because it exposed something profoundly uncomfortable. The gap between public policy and covert decision-making. It is important to remember the context. The 1980s were shaped by ideological fear, global rivalry, and strategies of indirect intervention. Even within that tense environment, the disclosures triggered significant political shockwaves. They forced difficult questions. How much can be justified in the name of national interest? Where transparency ends? And how much of geopolitical reality remains hidden from public view? The Iran-Contra affair remains one of those episodes that reminds us that some of the most controversial stories did not emerge from imagination, but from investigations, documents, and truths revealed far too late. During the Cold War, Europe became one of the most tense geopolitical arenas in the world. Not merely a continent divided between East and West, but a landscape shaped by fear, suspicion, and constant scenarios of conflict. The fear of a potential Soviet invasion was not imaginary. It was treated as a very real strategic possibility. Within this atmosphere, structures were created that would remain hidden from public awareness for decades. Operation Gladio. For many years, the name itself was associated with rumors, speculation, and what were often dismissed as conspiracy theories, because the idea sounded almost unbelievable. Secret networks, clandestine cells, paramilitary structures operating in the shadows within democratic European states. Yet the concept behind Gladio was, at least officially, rooted in Cold War strategy. The so-called stay-behind networks. Covert organizations prepared for an extreme contingency. If Soviet forces were to invade and occupy parts of Western Europe, these networks would activate resistance operations. Sabotage. Intelligence gathering. Guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines. The existence of such networks was later acknowledged in several countries, including Italy, Belgium, France, and Germany. The public reaction was one of shock, because most citizens had never been aware that such clandestine structures existed within their own nations. In Italy, revelations in the early 1990s triggered official parliamentary investigations. The term Gladio entered public discourse, no longer confined to speculation. With confirmation, however, came controversy. Some investigations, journalists, and researchers raised questions about possible connections between these stay-behind networks and periods of political instability, acts of violence, or covert influence operations. One phrase frequently associated with this debate was the strategy of tension. The suggestion that certain violent events might have been used to generate fear and shape political outcomes. It is essential to remain balanced. The existence of the networks themselves was confirmed. Interpretations regarding their role in specific events remain heavily debated and controversial. And this is precisely where the subject often drifts into the realm of conspiracy. Because when secret structures, covert planning, and decades of silence intersect, public trust is inevitably strained. For many people, the concept initially seemed absurd. It sounds like a movie. It sounds exaggerated. This couldn't happen in democratic states. But Cold War reality was defined by extreme scenarios. Covert operations. Psychological warfare. Hidden strategies designed for a world perceived as permanently on the edge of catastrophe. Operation Gladio remains one of those historical episodes that reveals this complexity. Not only through what was eventually acknowledged, but through the questions it continues to raise. How much of national security architecture remained invisible? How many decisions were made beyond public awareness? And how thin the line can become between strategic defense and the perception of manipulation. Because sometimes history is not entirely false. But neither is it entirely visible. During the Cold War, nuclear fear was not an abstract concept. It was a daily reality. Atomic tests conducted by major powers raised serious concerns among scientists. Not only because of immediate destruction, but because of the invisible and long-term effects of radiation on both the environment and the human body. Within this climate, Project Sunshine emerged. Launched in the late 1950s, it was an international research program designed to study the biological impact of radioactive fallout produced by nuclear explosions. One of the primary elements of interest was strontium-90, a radioactive isotope created through nuclear fission. Strontium-90 posed a unique danger because of its chemical similarity to calcium. Once released into the environment, it could enter the food chain, be absorbed by the human body, and accumulate in bones and teeth. And once embedded, it could remain there for years, continuously exposing surrounding tissue to radiation. For researchers, the questions were urgent. How much strontium-90 was entering the human body? How did it accumulate? What were the long-term biological risks? Officially, Project Sunshine was presented as a scientific and public health initiative. An effort to understand the consequences of nuclear testing. An attempt to measure exposure levels. A way to assess potential risks to civilian populations. But what later made the program deeply controversial were the methods involved. Investigations and declassified information revealed that the study relied on the collection and analysis of human tissue samples, particularly bones, obtained from deceased individuals. From a scientific perspective, bones were essential. They provided direct evidence of strontium-90 accumulation. However, ethical concerns emerged when it became clear that in some cases families had not been fully informed. Consent had not always been explicitly obtained. For the public, the revelations were profoundly unsettling. Because the idea that human remains could be used in research without the knowledge or approval of relatives directly challenged moral and ethical expectations. It sounded unbelievable. Like something taken from a conspiracy theory. Yet the existence of Project Sunshine was confirmed through official records, scientific reports, and journalistic investigations. Understanding the historical context is essential. The 1950s and 1960s were dominated by an escalating nuclear arms race. Atmospheric tests released massive quantities of radioactive material. Governments and scientific institutions operated under intense pressure to rapidly assess potential dangers. Fear shaped priorities. Urgency shaped decisions. Even so, Project Sunshine later became a widely cited example in debates surrounding research ethics. Because it raised uncomfortable questions. Where is the boundary between scientific necessity and respect for the individual? How far can governments and institutions go in the name of national security? And how easily can ethics become blurred when the perceived stakes are existential? Project Sunshine is not merely a story about radiation and nuclear science. It is a story about fear. About urgency. About decisions made in an era where global catastrophe seemed possible at any moment. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it is a reminder that some truths are not disturbing because they are mysterious but because they are real. They called it paranoia. History called it truth.